Hello. Welcome to GMAT Club's special session on the official test Enhanced Score Report. I'll be with you for the next hour to figure out what kind of data is in here and how you can use it to hopefully get a better score the next time you take the test. My name is Stacey Koprince. I'm an instructor with Manhattan Prep. We do basically all things business school. So I teach the GMAT, the GRE, and the EA, which is a new test that just started a few years ago that's also used for business school. I also work full-time for the company as the director of content and curriculum, which basically means my team makes the books and the practice tests and all the stuff that you study from if you use any of our materials. I see lots of questions already, or a couple questions already coming in the live chat. Please feel free to ask questions at any time. I may defer answering a particular question until we get to that part of the enhanced score report. So if you do have a question about a specific part of the ESR, just pop that in when we get to an example of that page or that chart, and I'd be happy to address any questions at that point. And the other thing that you can do if you want to is to follow along at home on so there's an article that I wrote for MBA.com, which is the official site where you sign up to take the test. And that article is exactly what we're going to talk about today, which is how to analyze your enhanced score report. And Abhishek, I don't see that I can type in the comment thing itself. I just put that in the private chat, the link in there. Can you stick that link in for everybody? So if you want to, or if you just want to bookmark that article for later, you can go ahead and follow through on that as well. That shows screenshots of different test takers' exams and then explains how to analyze each chart. Okay, so big picture, the enhanced score report, I'm going to call this the ESR for the next hour. It costs about $30 US to purchase after you've taken an official test, and it gives you additional data on all the different parts of your test. Not as much data as I'd like to have, but some good data that's useful if you want to retake the exam. A couple of things. This report is available if you take the test in a testing center. If you take the test online, then unfortunately you can't purchase this report. You can't get this data for your test. My assumption, they just launched the online version of the exam, obviously, when the pandemic came around, and my assumption is that they're still working on being able to extract the data in the way that they would need to be able to produce these reports. So if you are planning to take the exam more than once, then you may want to take it the first time in a testing center in order to be able to get this data if you decide that you want it in preparation for retaking the exam. And I would say something like, when I'm looking at, I've looked at hundreds of score reports, and I would say something like, I don't know, 19 out of 20 or maybe even 29 out of 30 are useful in some way. They have data that you can actually use to help get better before you go back in there and take the test again. Every now and then I run across a report that's just not that useful, and there's usually a couple of reasons why this can happen. Sometimes, so these score reports show all of the questions that counted towards your score. But as you may or may not know already, there are a certain number of questions that don't count towards your score. They're called non-operational questions, or more popularly, the experimental questions. So the experimental question data is the test makers doing research on test questions before they give them for real to people. And that data, any of those questions, that data is not included in the score report that we get after we take the exam. So sometimes there are big differences between how you spent your time or how you did on counted versus uncounted questions that can make the data be a little bit screwy when you see the report just for the counted questions. Sometimes all of the data is very middle of the road. So the chart is sort of like everything's about the same all the way through. And the biggest thing that we're looking for as we look through all of these reports is differences in the data. You're much better at data sufficiency than you are at problem solving or something like that. So every now and then I see a report where pretty much everything is middle of the road in the report. So there's no real differences for us to work with. I got about 20 reports submitted today from different people who are watching right now, and one of the reports out of those 20 fell into that category. There wasn't really much I could do with it because unfortunately the data was all very middle of the road. And then sometimes the data can be seem contradictory if someone, for example, runs out of time with 10 questions to go in the section or something like that. And so that can really mess with what we're seeing in the data because of that circumstance, if they're just clicking to answer the last 10 questions as quickly as possible before time runs out or something like that. So just buyer beware, essentially, if you're going to pay the $30 US to get this report. There's a pretty good chance that there will be something in there that will be useful for you before you go take the real test again. But every now and then it is the case that the data isn't particularly helpful. It's just FYI on that. Okay, with that preamble, let's dive in and start taking a look. So a bunch of people submitted ESRs. Thank you very much for submitting those. I went through those this weekend and took screenshots of a bunch of them to share. And what we're going to do is we're going to go and look. I've got examples of every single chart that appears someplace in the report. We're going to go through and look. And basically, I'm going to ask you to tell me when I pop one up, what do you see? What do you think this means? And then I'll tell you what I think it means and we'll discuss. And if you have any questions about any of the data, certainly let me know. And here is the first page of the report. So this first page is kind of boring because it mostly has information that you already know. So when you walk out of the test, you will already know your total score and you will know your 3 subscores. Depending on when you purchase your IR or your ESR, you may or may not have your AWA score yet. If you wait to purchase it until after they've scored your essay, then you will have this score on here as well. And then the other thing this first page shows is just your average time per section. And this is usually pretty uniform for people unless you ran out of time and didn't finish the test in some way or something like that. But even then, the average time across the section still pretty much works out. So there's not super useful information down here. And Jaideep, yeah, I agree. This person has a really good IR score. This top score here is an 8 and a very, very good quant score. A top score here is a 51. So this person's probably going to need to, or not probably, is definitely going to need to focus on verbal in order to lift their score further from this score. So first page, pretty boring, but just confirms, yes, here are your scores, and this is what we've got. Okay. So here is the next report that we get. It's integrated reasoning. And I'm going to shut up now. Tell me what you see in this. How would you interpret this if this were your data? Kaushik, I agree. So Kaushik's saying didn't let go soon enough for the questions that they didn't get. Now this person scored a 7 overall, which is an excellent score. There's only one more point to get here. So this person honestly might not even bother to worry about this section when they retake the exam. To get a score of 7, so there are 12 questions in the IR section, probably about 9 of them count. So probably about 3 of them are experimental. And that's just based on the percentages that we see for what's going on down here. So probably this person missed 2 of the 9 counted questions in the IR section. And there's a significant time difference here, which multiple people are calling out, between the questions the person got right and the questions the person got wrong. And again, the data is not here for the non-operational or not counted questions. So we don't know how much time they spent or whether they spent a bunch of extra time on some of those or something like that. There are indeed experimental for IR too. Yeah, they have to test everything. All of these questions get tested on, I think, several hundred at least, if not several thousand people before they give them for real. They have to make sure that the questions are good, and they also have to figure out the difficulty levels of the questions. So what would someone do with this? So let's say that this person really does want to get an 8, or let's say this is somebody who got a 5 and so does want to improve their score, but sees this kind of split in the time. And so usually when you have something like this is average time across all correct, average time across all incorrect. If you had somebody who scored a 5, they got maybe half the questions right, half the questions wrong. And at that point, I'd say, okay, chances are you didn't spend 320 on every single incorrect question. Chances are there were a couple of questions that went to like 4 or 5 minutes, and you kind of messed up your section by spending all that extra time in a couple of questions that you then got wrong anyway. And that took time away from other questions that you might have been able to get if you hadn't made the decisions that you made, basically, to spend extra time on certain questions. And so I'd be looking at time management there and really decision making, which is so much of what the GMAT is about. It's I don't have enough time to do everything. We never have enough time to do everything on the test. And so where do I choose to spend my time, and where don't I choose to spend my time? Where am I going to cut myself off? And so this indicates that for someone with a lower score, this indicates that the person probably has some work to do to figure out better decisions to make on where to spend their time and where not to spend their time. Again, this person scored a 7 already. I probably wouldn't worry about the IR going back in to take it again. A 7 is a great score. That's good. That's more than good enough. Um, and someone's asking, is the 78% out of the 9 question or the counted questions, or the all 12 questions? So the data that's shown in this entire report is only the questions that are counted for you. All of the non-operational or experimental data has been stripped out and is not shown in this report. So based on the fact that this says 78%, that's why I'm saying presumably 9 questions counted, because the percentage works out to get, if you get 7 out of 9 correct, that's 78%. So that's my guess. Okay, so integrated reasoning, in this case, this person does fine. I would look though for big differences in timing and time management, because that can make a difference in what you would do next time. So take a look at this one, another IR report. What do you think about this one? We've certainly got a timing issue in the opposite direction this time. Now, to score a 3 overall, most of the time that corresponds to about 4 questions right. You could have 3 questions or 5 questions right. The average would be 4 questions right to get a score of 3. 4 questions correct at about 4.5 minutes per question is about 18 minutes total. Do some fast math here. That's about 60% of the time for the section to answer 4 out of 12 questions, or 1/3 of the questions. So there's a pacing issue here. And again, then I have a question too around how is this person making the decisions as they went? If these were the first, 4 questions that you saw, or the early questions that you saw, and you got sucked into spending lots of extra time on them, there may very well have been later questions that you could have answered more efficiently, and then maybe answered 5 or 6 of them correctly instead of 4 of them. And been able to get a higher score. And so on the IR section in particular, the IR is not adaptive the way the quant and verbal sections are. The questions that you're getting, or that we're all getting, it's a set panel that's been determined in advance, but they're not necessarily in order of difficulty or anything like that. So you could hit the hardest question as question 2 or 3, and then there could be easier questions coming later, or even at the very end of the section. You want to make sure that you give yourself a look at all of those questions, that you have a chance, just in case you can actually more easily answer the later ones. So again, there's some decision-making stuff going on here. And then the question for the ones that they got right, the other issue there is just, is there work that you can do to be able to still answer these, but more efficiently next time? If you're answering in 3.5 minutes versus 4.5 minutes, that makes a huge difference. That's another 4 minutes. That's another question that you can answer. And generally speaking, we recommend, so out of the 12 questions that are in an IR section, we recommend planning to answer like 9 to 10 of the questions. So planning on just bailing fast on 2 or 3 of the questions, whichever ones you think are the worst or the hardest ones. And so that gives you 3 to 3.5 minutes on average to be able to spend on the questions that you're actually trying to answer. So this person's not that far off if they follow that strategy, but one of the things to look at here too would be for the things you do know how to do, can you answer more efficiently? Also, though, it might be the case that 1 or 2 of these were just, you should have let that go and gotten it wrong faster and spent that time on other questions that you had a better chance of getting in a reasonable amount of time. Something like that. And Kaushik is saying maybe they saw the path to get to an answer and kept at it. And yeah, that might exactly be, that might have been what happened on one or a couple of these questions to really pop the time up. And this is where we get to the difference between school tests and real world decision making. On school tests, we were trying to get everything right. We typically didn't have the kind of very limited time that we do on this test or in the real world when we're just working or trying to get stuff done. And so that's where someone would need to work on adjusting and switching over their mentality from what I call old school, pun intended. So the way that we were taught to do this stuff in school and the way that you work and do stuff in real life. My boss would be pretty unhappy if I took 8 hours to do something that could, at 100%, that could have been done 90% in 2 hours, because then I could spend that other 6 hours doing other things that would be a lot more valuable for the business than to get that extra 10% for another 6 hours worth of work. So there are decisions you're making there in terms of like how good is good enough. And that's the mindset that you got to have on this test. It's not about getting everything right the way it was in school. Okay. Okay, so that's the IR section. That does come first in the report. We're going through the report in order of the way that the data shows up. Here's our first page of the verbal. What do you see here? This one's fairly obvious. I chose one here that definitely shows a difference. So I'll give it away because it's, like I said, pretty obvious. This person did a great job at sentence correction. And the area for improvement is in critical reasoning and reading comp. A couple of things here. One is just to note that, so if you have something that's at 80th percentile and something else that's at 75th percentile, I wouldn't consider that a statistically significant difference. I need to see numbers here that are more than about 15 percentile points different or spread out from each other in order to consider that really statistically significant. You're going to have, slightly easier or slightly harder questions for the different types. You're going to have something that's a strength versus a weakness. There are all kinds of reasons why the data in here there are all kinds of reasons in life why standard deviation exists. So if I saw something like, I don't think there's much of a difference between 51 and 56 here. I wouldn't say this person's better at critical reasoning than reading comp. I would say critical reasoning and reading comp are about the same. There is, however, a statistically significant difference between CR and RC collectively and SC performance. So that's something to take a look at. The other thing I'm noticing down here is that the timing here, so verbal timing varies a little bit more than quant timing. But typically we're looking to spend approximately, or to average approximately, about 1:20 on sentence correction, about 2 minutes on critical reasoning, and also roughly 2 minutes or just under 2 minutes on reading comp. And so one of the things I'm noticing is that the person's going a bit faster on reading comp, and that's also their lowest of the three, or it's about the same as critical reasoning, and taking a bit more time at sentence correction, although certainly that's paying off. This person's doing an amazing job at sentence correction. So one of the things that I would just look at here is, you're getting so many right. Can you learn to do these? Can you learn to streamline so that you can get this average to be 130 or 125 or something like that? And then take that extra time and pop it over here, particularly into reading comprehension. And then maybe that extra time will actually help you to push these up a little bit. The other thing I'm just noticing is the pairing here of CR and RC. So these two question types are much more similar to each other than to sentence correction. And so this is likely indicating that there's some work to be done in terms of being able to read a paragraph or a couple of paragraphs of text and interpret it, analyze it. So there's some work to be done on that sort of deeper reading as opposed to sentence correction, which is one pretty awful sentence, but one sentence at a time, as opposed to longer text like these two up here. Yes, and MT, we will take a look at that in a second. I have one more example of these before we get into that. Um, and okay, Menahemeth. So if a person gets 85th percentile in reading comp and 75th percentile in both SC and CR, then approximately what would be the overall verbal section? So your question assumes that the three are weighted the same, first of all, and that we know exactly how the algorithm works, second of all, and that neither of those things is true. We don't actually know. So it's not possible to look at the percentiles. You can't just take the percentiles and like average them to get what the overall percentile is. It doesn't actually work that way. And they do not disclose the algorithm, so how they get to the scores that they get for either the two subsections, the verbal and quant subsections, or how they convert from those to the overall score. That's part of their secret sauce, basically. Oh, and good question. So JDeep is asking, so could this be higher? Could the time here be higher because this person's specifically getting 700 level or higher level, basically harder level sentence correction? So one of the things I should mention is the algorithm is not keeping track of like, oh, this person's doing better at sentence correction than at CR and RC, so let's give them harder SC specifically. The test is choosing what question comes next. And one of the annoying things, and so this could be part of what's going on and part of what contributes to the standard deviation I was mentioning earlier. This person could be doing super great on sentence correction and they keep getting sentence correction right. And then the next question's a CR. So they keep getting harder CRs because they're always getting the SCs right. And then it's harder for them to do well on the CRs. And so that can knock this down a bit. And so that's why I say if it's within about 15 percentile points here, I just consider that part of the noise. But if it's a greater difference, then yeah, there's something to look at there in terms of not just the vagaries of how the test works, but something going on there where the person may be able to improve their performance. And actually, I think that addresses the question that you're asking as well, but let me know if you have anything more that you want to talk about there. So here's a different person's first verbal page. And JDeep, yes, I think for the one that we just looked at, yes. Focus on RC and CR for sure. So in this one, you can see that RC is the lower one. CR is amazing this time. Doesn't get much better than that. And sentence correction is also very strong on this one. The timing is even more in the same direction that we saw before. So some extra time going to sentence correction and then fast on CR and RC. But look at the difference this time. So this person's going super fast on critical reasoning, but it's paying off. So who cares? Great. Like keep doing what you're doing. I don't want to touch CR. Sorry, I think I said RC a second ago. CR. You're doing an amazing job on CR. Keep doing what you're doing. It's amazing. For RC, yes, it's lower, but also you're rushing RC. And so one of the questions I would still say here, okay, what can you do to try to streamline sentence correction? Alternatively, it might be the case that this is high because you were being stubborn on just a couple of sentence correction questions, and maybe it would have been better to let those go to be able to spend some more time on reading comprehension. There is a balance between all of these in that if you're missing, basically, if you're missing things that you could have gotten, but you're missing them because you've mismanaged your time or because you're getting mentally fatigued or something like that. That's okay for a couple of questions in the section, but if it happens too much, by the end of the section, it's going to bring your score lower than it could have been. And so it's really important, again, to get out of this old school mentality of I've got to get everything right and be able to make good business decisions about what's actually worth my time here and my mental energy and what's not. And mental energy is almost more important than time because my clock will reset when I start the next section, but my mental energy is not going to reset until tomorrow, until after I sleep it off tonight and come back in tomorrow. So you're making decisions not just based on the time that you have available in the section that you're in right now, but also based on maintaining your mental energy for the roughly 3 hours that the test is going on, and minimizing the number of times that you're going to miss something that you know how to do, that point that you know how to get, just because you either mismanaged your time or mismanaged your mental energy, or both of those. So CR, keep going. RC and SC here. SC, can I streamline it, or are there a couple that I should be being less stubborn on and letting go so that I can take that time and move it more over to reading comprehension and see what's going on there? Just taking a look at the chat here as well. And MT saying, I'd say that the RC passages are more difficult than the ones you get in the OG. I think they can be. I also think that when you open the OG and just do a passage, that's a very different scenario than being a half an hour or an hour or an hour and a half into a test where you're using your brain and you only had one 8-minute break in the middle, and now you're having to read this big long passage. I think that's one of the hardest things to do once you start to get mentally fatigued, because there's so much that you're trying to keep track of. The same is true within integrated reasoning and the multi-source reasoning. And one of the reasons I think most people really don't like multi-source reasoning passages is because by the time you get to it, you're so tired and there are so many things to keep track of that it's a much harder setup, or a much harder prospect. And I will say there are in the latest OG that had new passages in it, which was the 2021/2022. There are a couple passages in there that were added in there that are really quite dense, that are pretty challenging. Yeah. Okay, let's go take a look at some more. So that's the end of our first verbal page. The next verbal page, someone asked a question about this earlier. So here's the next thing we get. We get something called verbal by skill. They take each of the 3 question types and they break them down into 2 groups. Anmol, yes, I recognize your name. I did use yours. So this chart, this verbal by skill chart, I think is the least useful of all of the charts that are in this report. It's a little bit more useful on the quant section than on the verbal section. So specifically this one, verbal by skill, I think is the least useful of all of them. And that's basically for 2 reasons. One is 2 related reasons. One is, for each of these 3 question types, they break it down into just 2 categories. So there's not a lot to work with there. There's just 2 categories, like everything's in one of these 2 categories. So that's something. And then the other thing is, as someone mentioned in their question earlier, I forget your name, sorry, but I saw it at the beginning. Like, what does it mean if I need to work on analysis critique? Or what does it mean if I need to work on construction plan? Like, what is that? Down in RC, this is more straightforward. Basically, this first one is inference questions, and I would call this pretty much everything else. These ones are more opaque. Down here, I'm guessing that communication basically means meaning when the question's testing meaning, and that grammar is more like the nitpicky grammar rules. That's my guess. So one of the things that you can do, the up here for critical reasoning, these don't fall into the classic categories that everybody talks about on GMAT Club or in the books that you're studying from. So strengthen or weaken, or assumption questions, or that sort of thing. These don't really fit those categories. One thing that you can do, though, is go and look in your official guide. Have you noticed in the explanation section of the official guide, so where they're showing you the solution to the problems, they're all categorized. So at the top of the solution, it gives you information about that particular problem. And so they're all categorized according to these. So you'll see them labeled analysis, critique, or construction plan. And I think in the later OGs, I have to check on this. I can't remember now. I should have checked before the session. In the later OGs, they might actually have listed these at the end, but I'm not sure about that. Anyway, so you can go and look and see, well, what do they label analysis or critique, or what do they label construction or plan, so that you can get a sense of what are the things that I need to work on for this one. But it's kind of opaque. It's not super clear exactly what this is talking about. This one I pulled up specifically because this person does have an issue with inference on reading comp. And so this is a spot where the person wants to work. And in particular for inference, these show up in other places in the test. So critical reasoning also has inference questions, and integrated reasoning also has inference questions. So this skill, or this analysis that they're asking us to do specifically to infer, is something that appears in many places in the test. And so that's something definitely that you'd want to work on. It looks like you were fine with, I don't know where inference falls up here, but it looks like you were fine with it in critical reasoning. One question I would have is, how is it in integrated reasoning? Is there anything that you need to work on there specifically around inference? And then I would go and compare, and go look at official guide questions or whatever, and compare what is it about reading comp. It might just be that you had harder ones on this test, or that you missed them on this test for whatever reason. But can you figure out why it seemed like it was fine for critical reasoning, but not for reading comp on this particular test? Is there something there about the way that it's getting asked, or about the additional information that we get for reading comp, or something like that, that's distracting you or messing you up when you're answering inference questions in particular? And in integrated reasoning, if that's the case, that it has something to do with the volume of information that you're getting, then I would also expect to see data in your integrated reasoning, not on this test because they don't give it to us, but in integrated reasoning out of the official guide or wherever. There on MSR, multi-source reasoning, I would expect you also to have some issues with inference there that need to be worked on. So that's something to take a look at. And as I said before, on the earlier chart, something that's close, I don't consider this statistically significant. This is fine. These are both okay. Whoops, sorry, I'm trying to do this. This is okay. This, however, is a big enough difference that something was going on there. Go see if you can figure out what was going on there. And let me just check the chat. And someone's asking, well, I have my ESR, would you be able to help me review it? So I'll later on, remind me of that at the end. I'll give you a link to our forums, and you can come onto our forums and share your data there, and then we can tell you what we think about it. Yeah, MT, I agree that there's not useful, in particular for this, there's not that useful info. This is more straightforward. Again, if we interpret this as meaning versus nitpicky grammar, this is a little more straightforward. CR is kind of hard to read from this report. Stated idea is basically, I'm asking you a question about what I told you I'm just asking you to give back to me what I already told you in the passage, versus inference is asking you to take another step with the information. So this is more directly stated in the passage. And if I saw a reverse of this, where someone was fine with inference but had stated idea lower, I would say there, be careful. You might be going too quickly and not actually going back to check the passage. You might think you remember the detail, but you mix it up in your head, and they of course set traps for us based on that. You might also be going back and looking at the wrong part of the passage. So you might think that they're asking you about something here, but they're actually asking you about something down here. But that's more about going back and finding information that's in the passage and spitting it back to them. The other thing is that often for stated idea, they'll use synonyms. So they're not literally giving the exact wording that showed up in the passage. And so maybe the synonyms are what are tripping you up. And you think that it's saying something different than it is. Something like that. JD, remind me about that at the end of the session. I'll pull up my OG and we'll take a look. Okay. And Tarun's asking, is primary purpose part of inferred or stated? I'm not entirely sure. So they don't give us a list of that. If I had to guess, I would probably put it in infer, because I don't feel like that's a stated idea so much. But I don't know. I could also see that differing from question to question, depending on whether the question had a topic sentence that stated the main idea, or and whether it didn't, and you had to pull it out yourself. So yeah, all of these questions are great questions. This is why I said at the beginning, I'm not a huge fan of this particular chart. I think this particular chart is the least useful of all of the charts in the report, unfortunately. Okay. Here's another one. This is showing the reverse scenario here of inferred versus stated. And so we talked a little bit about that, where I'd be looking at, are you not going back into the passage to look for the proof, thinking that you remember the detail that was stated? That's always go back and look, always go back and confirm. Are you possibly looking at the wrong part of the passage? You thought it was talking about paragraph 1 when it was talking about paragraph 2, all of that kind of stuff. And on this one, there's also a big difference between grammar and communication. And so what I would say here on this one is, and a really big difference here, it looks like, again, if we interpret this as meaning, it looks like this person is fine when the issue that's going on in the sentence has to do with an illogical or an ambiguous meaning or something like that, but is struggling more when it gets down to the nitty gritty grammar rules. And so that's the focus, trust your ear, trust yourself when it's really about, hey, this doesn't make sense, or this is illogical, or something like that. But when it's about, hey, what's the subject verb agreement here? Or hey, is parallelism constructed correctly in this sentence? Make yourself actually go in and pick out the parts of the sentence that need to match. And don't just rely on your ear as much on those. MTA, agree with you that there's not a single sentence that's about both. That they mix grammar and communication in different sentences. I do wonder whether certainly if I were that, this is something that I would love to have on our own practice test. We don't have this yet, maybe one day, but I would actually, if I, in a perfect world, I would actually rate each of the answer choices based on what the primary issue was going on in that answer choice, so that the data would get down to that level of granularity. So not as the overall question, but for sentence correction in particular, down to the individual answer choices. But I have no idea whether they actually do that for sentence correction. All right, here, before I show you this one, sorry, I'm scrolling back up. So the next set of data is 3 charts that appear on a page together. You have to interpret all 3 charts together. Looking at any one individually, it might give you some ideas or hypotheses, but you got to interpret all 3 together. So here you go, take a look at across all 3 of these and tell me what you think. This is one of the most classic patterns that I see uh, in score reports and on our own practice tests when I'm looking at data for my own students on our practice tests. And Rohit's asking, what's the distribution of questions, the typical distribution of questions for RC, SC, and CR in the verbal section? So there's not an exact number, but it typically is the case that you would get about 12 to 14 RC questions, about 9 to 10 CR questions, and then the rest SC. So CR typically is they're all pretty close, but CR typically is the one where you'd see the fewest. And then SC typically is the one where you'd see the most. But pretty close to each other. So, okay, so what was going on here? So this person started off, so I'm glancing at this, I'm just looking at this, like they started off, okay, oh, really picked it up in the second and third quadrants, but kind of crashed in the last quadrant. What's going on down here? They lifted their score. The green line here is the average difficulty overall. So they were generally lifting their score, kind of leveled off here, lifted a little bit again towards the end. Okay, and then, okay, here's the big story of what makes all of those pieces come together. Whoops, sorry, wrong tool. So on verbal, we have 65 minutes to answer 36 questions, which on average means about 1:48 per question. So this person was spending extra time in each of the first 3 quadrants, anywhere between about 10 seconds and 20, 25 seconds extra per question. And these quadrants they basically split up the counted questions in groups of four quadrants, and just even groups of 4 basically in the order in which you answered them on the test. So this person ran out of time. So now this makes sense that all of a sudden their performance tanked in that last section because they had less than a minute on average to answer every question. So, okay, this makes complete sense. And so basically this is back to that decision-making time management issue. Chances are that they weren't spending 2 minutes and 11 seconds on each question in that first quadrant, but that there were some questions that were faster and some questions that were slower. And so the first thing I'd be going to look at, for example, in our own practice tests, if this person took our practice tests, is, well, where's the time going? Let's look at the ones specifically that you got right versus wrong. And let's try to figure out where you're spending that extra time. A lot of times what I will see is that these ones here were some of the ones that just way too much extra time was spent. And so the lesson there is learn how to bail faster, learn how to get out when the question's just not happening, and save that time. In this case, for right here for the 4th quadrant. The other thing I'll mention that I can't see in the PDFs that I was sent, you can't see it in the PDFs either, but you can see it when you're looking at the score report on the MBA.com website, is that if you hover your mouse over these little parts of the pie chart here, you will see the actual average time for the blue, which is the correct ones, and the average time for the red, which is the incorrect ones. To start, I would just look at where this falls. So this person spent more time on the ones that they got right. That's good. But a lot of times what I'll also see is that the red is more over here. And so they spent extra time overall, yes, but most of that extra time went to questions that they got wrong anyway. And so that indicates, okay, there's a decision-making issue here that has to be worked out before you take this test again, if you want to try to maximize your score when you get in there. And just taking a look at our chat again here. And someone's asking, Shubham's asking, I had an accuracy of 75, 86, and 71 in the first 3 quadrants, but ended up with a 28 overall. How does that work? So you can think of the quant and verbal sections of the GMAT or of any question adaptive test as a where you end is what you get test. The algorithm's literally calculating your score after every single question that you answer. And so where you end is your score. It's like a trajectory. And so your trajectory would have been something like this. You didn't tell me the 4th quadrant, but I'm guessing it's a lot lower. And so where you end is what you get, because it's that trajectory is essentially your score. So you can you can get everything right in the 1st and 2nd quadrants and then get everything wrong in the 3rd and 4th quadrants, and you'll get a really, really low score. It's not an average of your performance. It's not like a classic test that we took on paper in school where you just added up the points or took an average of something. That's not how the algorithm works. Really, really annoying, but something that you want to understand and get used to before you go in there and take the official test for the first time or take it again. And great question, Many Hemant. When do you decide to bail on a question? So first of all, I know before I go in and take the test, the kinds of things that are more likely and less likely to pay off for me. So I already have in my head before I go in an idea of, if I see this, there's a decent chance that I'm going to bail on it. I also pay attention just to, like, I have certain markers for myself on the different question types. For example, in sentence correction, I read the original sentence. And let's say that I don't understand, like I can't even follow the original sentence because it's so hard or so convoluted. And I kind of pause. I'm like, I didn't get that. I go back and I try to read the sentence again. I still don't get it. Okay. Now I'm going to take that part and I'm going to read it with answer choice E put into the underline. And I do that because answer choice E is usually the most different from answer choice A. So I try reading it again that way. Maybe that will help me figure out what's going on with the sentence. If I read it again that way and I'm still like, I don't even understand the sentence structure, I don't understand what's going on in the sentence, then I know I'm done. I'm not going to keep because I don't understand what's going on. So those things are basically, I have certain decision points for myself that's based on, by now I should understand what it's saying and what it's asking me to do. And if by now I don't understand what it's saying or what it's asking me to do, then I'm done with this and move on. So you have to figure that out for yourself because obviously that's different for each person, but go into the test knowing automatically. For example, a lot of my students are not fans of full sentence underlines on sentence correction. Or a lot of my students are not fans of like hard science topics like astronomy or something like that. And so if they see things like that, they know they're going to start speeding up or not answering all of the questions or something like that, bailing on some of the questions. Yeah. And this person needs to do exactly what I'm saying to cut off some of this time, even possibly in some of the ones that they got right. You have to average a minute 48 on verbal. If you spend double that time on a single question, well, no single question is worth the amount of time that you would normally take to answer 2 questions. Because that's 2 questions, right? No single question is worth 2 questions. All the questions are worth pretty much the same. So it's basically that decision making and balancing the time. Okay, here's a third one. What about this one? This is a really interesting one. I don't see this circumstance quite as often as the first 2 that we saw. So this first quadrant, amazing. First of all, the person got everything right in the first quadrant. And second of all, did so quickly. So this person is strong at verbal. This person's stronger certainly than a 35 at verbal. You can't get 100% of the questions right in the first quadrant at that speed without being strong at verbal. So what happened? And so here's where I would speculate. And a lot of this too is like a conversation where I would ask my student, well, did this happen? And could this be what was going on? So questions got a lot harder, certainly, after that performance in the first quadrant. Amazing. And possibly the person was just in this mode of like, okay, go, go, go. And so didn't slow down enough. There's this balance here, right? In the same way that it's problematic to go too slow, it can be problematic to go too fast because you're increasing the chances that you're going to make a careless mistake if you go too quickly. So there's this like, you got to find that sweet spot in the middle where it's neither too slow nor too fast. And so my speculation here is that the person was like, go, 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 and kept going too quickly, took a while to slow down, basically. And then sometime in the third quadrant, they finally were like, okay, slow down, slow down. But by then the damage was done. By then they had missed enough questions that they'd pulled their score down. And they did recover somewhat in the last quadrant and start to pull their score back up again. But not enough of the test was left basically to keep pulling back up. But given the performance in the first quadrant, my guess is that this person probably could be scoring 40 plus in the verbal section if they can balance this timing better, balance the decision making better as they go through. That would be my best guess. All right, I'm looking at my clock. We still have quant to do, and we have 10 minutes, so let's pick this up. This is a third one, but I'm just going to tell you what's going on in this one because I want us to get to quant. So this one we've got percentage correct-wise, a pretty strong first couple of quadrants, but then really dipped in the third quadrant and started to balance it out in the last quadrant. The other thing that I want you to note on this one is see this red line? It's dipping below the blue line. And the red line represents incorrect and the blue line represents correct. So this person had an inversion in the second and third quadrants where they were actually missing easier questions compared to the ones that they were answering correctly. And then the time that I see here is fast for quadrants first, third, and fourth, but then a little bit slower in quadrant two. And so here's what I'm going to speculate happened here. Person had a pretty strong first quadrant, got most of the questions right, and did so about 15 seconds per question faster than the average. Naturally got harder questions. Difficulty goes up in the second quadrant because of that performance. And still did well in that section, but had to slow down quite a bit to do so. And this person might even have noticed that they were ahead in time somewhere in here and thought, oh, okay, I can slow down a little bit. It's okay. And then slowed down too much, possibly. So while this one was about 15 seconds per question faster than average, this one's about 40 seconds slower than average. And so then the person might have noticed, oh no, I'm really behind on time. So they started to speed up again. And they actually, it looks like they may have finished the section early. It's also, I don't know for sure because the non-operational or experimental data isn't in here. So they might have just used the extra time on the uncounted questions, but just based on this data, it's possible the person actually sped up so much that they finished the section early. And so there's certainly a time management decision-making thing going on here. And the other thing I'll point out is that for two of these quadrants, that extra time, and in particular this one, which was percentage-wise the worst quadrant, a little bit more time spent on incorrect than correct again, but even still just too fast in general for these two quadrants. When you're going at this speed, you're going to make careless mistakes. It's just too hard when you're going that fast to be as diligent as you need to be on the test. So I would guess that at least here, I would guess that the person became aware at some point that they were behind on time, and that kind of leads to panic mode, and you start going quickly, and then you end up going too quickly. But this person can certainly, if they learn to balance that out, can certainly lift the score without a question. Oh, JD. Okay, sorry. I'm just looking in the, all right. So you did speed up. All right. Yeah. Okay. Okay. All right. Let's go take a look at quant. So the first quant page is going to look like this. It's going to tell you your overall score, which you already know. And then it's going to break down that score into PS and DS, the two question types. And then overall, two broad categories, arithmetic and then algebra and geometry. And just like I said before here, I'd really be looking at differences of about 15 percentile points or more to consider it statistically significant. So in the case of this chart, this person is statistically significantly better at data sufficiency than at problem solving. These ones are close enough to maybe there's a little bit of an edge to algebra geometry, and maybe they're about the same, and this is just within the noise of the data. But also compare this to down here. Notice what's going on there? This person's great at data sufficiency. They're at 70th percentile, and they're answering it fast. Supposed to average about 2 minutes. They're spending 30 seconds per question longer on problem solving and getting fewer of those right, and missing basically the same level questions that they might actually be answering correctly on data sufficiency. So obviously PS needs some work, and in particular when I see this kind of split between DS and PS and the time as well. What that tells me is this person knows the rules. This person knows the theory behind the math. Where they're struggling is when they actually have to do the computations or the calculations out. Because on data efficiency, you can get away with not doing that a lot of the time. You can get away with skipping a lot of the actual math. But on problem solving, you have to go do it. And so we're looking not just at PS, but also the ability specifically to do that computation on paper and to do the computation to the end. The other thing to think about there goes back to old school versus this test and what you want to do on this test, which is, do you really need to do the computation all the way to the end? Maybe you could have estimated. Even when the problem doesn't tell you that you can estimate, a lot of times halfway through, the answers are spread out far enough that you can like start to estimate partway through. Or maybe you could have just used the answers and worked backwards versus, trying to set up equations and solve or something like that. And that might have been easier than trying to translate the equations on a particularly complicated problem. So I'd be looking at what I call test taking strategies as opposed to textbook strategies. So textbook would be the way your math teacher taught you to do it in school. It's certainly possible to use those on this test. I would not be able to score in the 99th percentile on this test if I had to use only textbook approaches. No way. It would not happen on the math section. Um, my top score on this test is a 780. I could not get a 780 without working backwards from the answers, without plugging in my own numbers, testing cases, estimating all these strategies that you can use to make the test easier and faster to get through. So that's where I'd tell this person to take a look. Good question. So what would we do if they had the reversed rankings with PS and DS? So my first question would be, how comfortable do you feel with data sufficiency? I would also be looking at the timing down here, because a lot of times what I see is that people feel more comfortable with problem solving because that's how stuff was in school. Data sufficiency is weird, right? If I saw a similar thing where data sufficiency was fast but lower, I would say, are you spending less time on data sufficiency sort of artificially because you're less comfortable with it? So you're kind of rushing through it. And then you're spending that time on problem solving because you feel more comfortable with it. So you might be shooting yourself in your own foot by just not giving yourself enough time on data sufficiency. So that's one thing I would look at. And then the next thing that I would look at, if that's not an issue, if there's not a timing discrepancy there, the next thing that I would look at is just your overall comfort and competency with the process of data sufficiency in general. How often when you go back and review, do you realize that you made a careless mistake with data sufficiency, that you didn't consider a certain case, or you forgot to think about negative numbers as well as positive numbers, or fractions as well as integers, or that the process by which you were going through meant that you didn't consider all of the possible cases of the way that something could play out. So how often in practice on data sufficiency is it that you're looking at something and going, oh, I should have had that, versus I really didn't know how to do this one. So something like that. Yeah, I'd say that timing is about average. I wouldn't say there's a big difference in the timing there. So then I would go back and look at process for data sufficiency. If your PS is really good, you know the rules, you know the formulas, you know the theory, so that's not the issue. Then the issue becomes about the process of how data sufficiency works. Something like that. And this is another one. And this one here, we're going to take a look at, we still have the same issue here with PS and DS, but here I just wanted to show the arithmetic versus algebra and the issue that's going on here. So arithmetic is lower than algebra geometry, and did arithmetic way more time than algebra geometry. So something's going on, something pretty big. There's a huge difference in the time right here. So something pretty big is going on with arithmetic. Some of this, if the numbers were closer, some of it could be just randomly you happen to get some harder arithmetic problems. But the discrepancies that we're seeing here are decently sized enough that there's probably some issues, again, with doing the paper on math. It's been a lot longer since you had to do a lot of arithmetic. And the arithmetic that they make us do on paper here is more complicated than what we were taught to do in school. And again, I would go back to, probably you're going to need to stop focusing so much on textbook approaches, and you're going to need to start feeling a lot more comfortable with test taking approaches in order to fix this, in order to lift this. Okay, then we get the skill groupings. So this is a little bit more useful than the verbal equivalent of this chart, and that's because they break all of quant into 5 categories. And so there's some more granular detail or data here. And these categories are more specific about what exactly they cover. And so we can see, for example, this particular person needs some work on what I'll call classic algebra skills, equations and equalities, or equations, inequalities, and algebra skills in general. So this stuff also, I should also mention when you get your ESR, it does have like a FAQ page, frequently asked questions page you can go to that provides a little bit more detail about all of these categories. I do think that detail is useful within the quant categories. So go take a look at that. On the verbal side, the detail is still not very useful when they describe each category. But on the quant side, it's pretty good. Uh, JD, arithmetic is potentially FDP questions. It's basically questions that aren't giving you variables or giving you equations or that sort of thing. So a story problem could end up being an arithmetic question, but it could also end up being an algebra question depending on the details of that story. The only overall one that's really clear is geometry questions are geometry. Fall into algebra geometry. But basically, if you see something that's not outright giving you a bunch of variables or equations or something, then it's probably arithmetic. All right, let's go take a look at the 3 chart for quant. Take a minute to examine this one. And yes, as Manny Hemanth is pointing out, the top chart here is showing percent correct, not percentile. So percent correct and percentile are different. Percent correct doesn't tell you anything about how hard the questions were. And this is similar to one of our earlier verbal ones. The person started out great, 100% correct, didn't need to spend any extra time to do that. So average just about the 2 minutes here. Naturally got harder questions in the second quadrant because they did so well, or throughout this whole thing, the test itself is not split into quadrants. So as they were doing well, of course, they were earning harder questions. And then really slowed down because the questions were harder, but also look at where that time went. They mostly slowed down on the ones that they got wrong anyway. So although this is already an excellent quant score, if you're looking to get another couple of points here, need to be willing to bail even at the top level, the hardest questions, even if you're going for a 50 or a 51 score, you need to be willing to bail when the questions are just too hard so that you don't find yourself in this scenario at the end of the test where you're having to rush. And I guarantee you this person missed questions right here that he or she could have gotten right if they hadn't been running out of time at the end of the section. And that might have meant, probably they were at something like a 49 or a 50 before going into that last quadrant. So it cost them a couple of points on the test. Navpreet is asking, another test prep company says the algorithm works differently for arithmetic versus algebra geometry. From everything that I know, it's not true, but also we would never know if it did because they don't disclose how the algorithm works. So it would be impossible for anybody to say that with certainty. But what they have told us is that all of the questions are treated the same or counted the same. The only difference is that by the time you get to the end of the section, they basically take a look at for everything that you've earned over that section, what are the couple of easiest and couple of hardest questions of the mix of questions that you earned in that section. And they discount the very top and the very bottom a little bit as outliers because they're not part of the core group of what you earned. That's the only difference in weighting that they've ever said exists on the section. But other than that, no. And they've also told us specifically between content area or DSMPS or SC and CR and RC, the algorithm is not adjusting and saying, oh, you did well on this, so I'll give you more of a harder this. It's all one big thing. And this person was even more extreme in this respect, super great in the first quadrant and super fast. So was able to spend basically more time in the later 3 quadrants here because they had gone so quickly and it didn't hurt them in terms of accuracy in the earlier part. But again, I'll point out here, decision making. Where the extra time was going was to questions that they got wrong. Chances are it wasn't the case that everyone that they got wrong was that extra time. So chances are that there was a mix here of questions where they spent too much time and then got them wrong anyway because they were too hard, and then questions where they made careless mistakes because of the extra time that they had spent on other questions. So there were probably a couple of questions, at least in this grouping here, that the person might have gotten, but that they rushed and then made a mistake on. Um, it would be great if, if we could know the exact time spent on each question and whether that question was right or wrong to be able to confirm or deny those hypotheses. But that's something I would go to look for in the person's practice tests to see whether that confirms the hypothesis. And JDeep is saying, I tend to rush in Q2 and Q3 in order to have more time. So drop questions more easily in order to have more time in Q4. Why is that not a good strategy, or is that a good strategy? And generally speaking, what I want you to do is have pretty steady time. I don't want you to think about needing to spend more time at the beginning or at the end or anywhere in the middle. It's basically, what's this question in front of me right now? Can I answer this question in a reasonable amount of time? If it's a math question, a reasonable amount of time is up to about 2:45 to 3 minutes for a subset of questions, because I will have a subset of questions that I can answer in a minute 15 or a minute 30. And I will also have a small number of questions that I just hate and bail on immediately. And so I save all that time for other questions. It's not worth it to spend, in my opinion, more than about 50% over the average time for that question type. So on math, over about 3 minutes, on SC, over about 2 minutes, and on CR and RC, over about 2.5 to 3 minutes. Because at that point, I'm using so much time on a single question. And by the way, mental energy, because if I need to spend that much time, it means this question's really hard for me, which means I'm using way more mental energy on this question than I would on other questions. I don't want to be in a position where I spend, 4 minutes on one question when I could have spent that on two questions. And the amount of mental energy that I'm spending to do one 4-minute question is more than the amount of time and mental energy I would spend to use that same 4 minutes to do two different questions that were both easier for me. So I'm really hurting myself. It's like a double whammy if I'm doing that, if I'm spending that amount of time. So it's really about the question in front of me, and I'm making the decision on the question in front of me based on what I know of my own strengths and weaknesses, based on whether this question is making sense to me in the moment. And like I said, I have my little decision points for each question type of, like, by now I should know what's going on if I don't know what's going on by this point in time. On math questions, it's about a minute in. If I still don't understand something about the question, or I'm still like trying to forget it, I'm not getting this, so I'm done. So question by question, question by question. That's the decision. And finally, I want to show this one. This person got a perfect score on the quant section. This is the highest score you can get, 51. And they still missed two questions. So this is my point. This is not like a school test. You could never get a perfect score on a school test and get some stuff wrong unless it was a weighted exam, which wasn't super common. It's not about getting everything right. The other thing I'll point out is this question, they spent a huge amount of time on that one question that they got wrong. This question, they had to rush. It wouldn't have made a difference here because they already got the top score, but this data is telling me this might have been a careless mistake because they just didn't have enough time. That even here, it would have been better to cut this question off, to avoid using up that mental energy and that time to minimize mistakes over here. They could have had a couple more careless mistakes and actually brought that score down. That was the risk right there. And Kaushik, yeah, so Kaushik asks, so should one bail on questions that they find too hard, even though they think they could potentially solve it? And then never mind, you answered the question. Good. Yes, I answered the question. The answer is yes, you should still bail. I once on the official test bailed on the last two questions in my quant section because they were both in my bail categories. I had like 8 minutes left. I had plenty of time. I could have done them. They were both in my bail categories. One of them in particular was a question type that I just hate and that stresses me out and that tires me out. And I still had the verbal section coming. So even though I had the time in the quant section, I decided it wasn't worth it. I decided that I wanted to save that mental energy for the verbal section. And when I finished that test, I got the same score on the quant section that I had gotten the last time I took the test when I didn't have to do that. So it really is about making those kinds of decisions as you go to maximize the collective, um, your collective performance across the whole section. And it's just like business decisions. You don't invest in every single business opportunity that comes your way just because it's there. You make decisions about where to spend your scarce resources in the real world. That's time and money. On this test, that's time and mental energy. What's the best use of spending those two scarce resources as you go through the whole section? And I have a question. Generally, is the first quarter the easiest one? No. The easiest quadrant depends entirely on how you're doing as you take the test. Generally speaking, the test is following you as you go. The only thing that you know is that the very first question is going to be somewhere in the middle range. After that, it depends entirely on your performance as you go. Okay, that's my last chart here. I'm going to stop sharing and come back to you. There was a lot going on in the chat window. If I missed something and you want to pop it back in, please go ahead and pop it back in. Questions, comments, anything you want to talk about? Oh, and I'm going to give you the link to our forums so that you can come and ask us there too if you want us to look at your ESR. Okay. Abhishek, I put the link for our forums in the private chat. So you grab that link, you can come on and ask. You can't actually, we ask that you not post your ESR. First of all, we don't want you posting that for the world. And also just, we have to be careful about downloading stuff for, virus reasons and et cetera. But what you can do is type in the data that you want us to, for whatever parts of it you want us to help you analyze. Just tell us what the data is for those parts and we'll help you try to figure out what it means. Value and order, yes, that can be things like factors. It can be, so hold on, let me just go pull up the ESR facts. Okay, I think they might have moved it. I think you have to get to that page when you are actually accessing the ESR logged into your account because their general FAQ is no longer showing the list. But if you look, go back into where you downloaded it, and from there, there's a FAQ page that you can get to that for each of those 5 quant categories gives more detail about what's actually included in that category. So, yeah. And Kaushik, I think I did, hold on one second. Oh, no, I'm sorry. Where is yours? Okay. Yeah, it was because the data was a little bit, I was going to show your verbal. You had some up and down timing in verbal. And my question there and for your quadrant 4 was, did you truly hit your difficulty limit there, or did you have some mental fatigue, or were you second guessing yourself, and that might have brought you down in quadrant 4? I also have a note that quadrant 1 might have had a careless error there. But there was also some data that was a little funky in the difficulty chart. That's why I ended up not showing yours. I'm sorry. I looked at it late last night and the difficulty data looked a little strange. Sometimes the charts are not that easy to read. I didn't want to confuse people on that. Sorry, scrolling back up in the chat. Okay. Official guide. Hold on one second. I'm just doing a search in my official guide, but the book is very large, so it's going to take a while. So while that's searching. Okay. So if you look at the back of the book, hold on a second. This is still grammar. Yeah. So if you look at the end of your official guide, if you have, I think they started to do this maybe in the 2020 or the 2021 edition, but at the back of the book in chapter 12, they basically list all of the questions and the categories. And so you'll see under critical reasoning, they've got argument construction, argument evaluation, evaluation of a plan, and so on. Just take a look over there. So someone's asking, would missing a question in the second quadrant be better than missing in the last one? If the location doesn't matter, the difficulty level matters. So missing an easier question is worse than missing a harder question. That's what matters. Oh, and the last chart. Sorry, I've got a question here. Can you explain the last chart, Q2 quant assessment? Couldn't get it. Quadrant 2. Hold on, I'm going to share my screen again. Tell me what it was there. And Alak is asking which quarter is the most important one. Again, the location doesn't matter. But I'm going to answer this question. What if I get a tough question in the start and I lose confidence? You want to get tough questions. If you earn a tough question, it means you're doing well on the test. So the attitude that you want to have is, yay, I earned a question that I can't do. Like that means that I'm working to the highest level, right? To the hardest level that I can work at. Great. And then I need to be able to be like, oh, and also I can't do that. So now I'm going to back away. I'm going to make a guess on that question, or I'm going to try to make an educated guess if I can. But my goal is to earn as many questions as possible that I can't do, because that means that I really am pushing up to the highest level that I'm capable of getting to on the test. Which is very different again from school test. In school test, if I saw a question that I didn't know how to do, I panicked because on school test I was supposed to know how to do everything, because my teacher told me everything, right? Like we were supposed to know in advance. That's not how this test works. You actually want that. It's not a comfortable feeling, but like that's what you want. You want to feel like the test is super hard and is just, like you're bashing your head against the test. That means you're doing well. I've got the main reason a lot of people will miss out on answering questions in the last quarter is because some test prep companies claim that the earlier quarters contribute more to your score than the fourth quarter. And it's true that some companies claim that. It is not true that that is true. The questions are essentially worth the same all the way through, except for the outlier thing that I was describing earlier. So yeah, you want a steady performance across the test. You don't want to lift up and then crash, because the test, like I said, is essentially a where you end is what you get test for the quant and verbal sections. Do the official practice tests behave differently than the actual test? The official practice tests, in my experience, have a narrower question pool, a shallower question pool. And so the higher you are scoring, the more likely you are to tap out the difficulty of the questions in the practice tests. And so in that circumstance, the real test will feel harder than the practice tests. Anecdotally, I can score an 800 on the practice test, official practice test, but my highest score on the real test is a 780. So, I'm tapping out the question pool on the official practice tests. The algorithm, they have said that the algorithm is the same for the practice test versus the official test. They have not answered the question of whether the practice tests count every single question or whether some of them are marked as experimental, although obviously they're not really experimental on a practice test. I don't know. But essentially the algorithm is the same. Typically, we will have 1 4-question reading comp and then 3 3-question reading comps. That's the most common combination. Oh, and analysis versus critique. Hold on, let me go back to. Oh, I see. Evaluation of a plan, argument construction, and hold on. Sorry, trying to get into this page. Right. Yeah, this is why I don't like that. This is why I'm not a fan of the CR categorizations. Yeah, I'm not entirely sure what they mean by the descriptions for critical reasoning in particular, unfortunately. And the difficulty level changes for every question. So they in the ESR they break things up into quarters just to make it easy to show you some data without showing you more data than they want to. But the test itself is not organized into quarters. When you're taking it, it's just question by question, and the difficulty level is adapting for every single question that you answer. And Kaushik, on if you can fix your RC from the last quadrant. Okay, and so that's what you had in that last quadrant was that 4-question RC. I mean, quadrant 4 was definitely where something went wrong, basically, on your test. And so if you remember that being RC in particular, then yes, go address whatever that is. The other question that I would have around that is around like, were there time management / mental fatigue decision making you could have done earlier that might have meant you were actually okay with RC? Like maybe it wasn't about the RC. Maybe it was about earlier decisions that you had made that then brought you down once you got to that hard passage towards the end of the test and you were getting tired and so on. So it might not literally just be about the question type itself. Okay, and let's see. And so for this one, for Q2 time management, did the person spend too much time on wrong questions? And Q2, so I see. So this right here. So I wouldn't say that so this person only missed 1 question in this quadrant. Really the only reason I'm showing this chart, this person did an amazing job. They got a perfect score. The only reason I'm showing this is to point out you can get questions wrong and still get a perfect score. So I wouldn't say that they spent too little time here because of the way it played out. They got them all right. But you are risking when you go super quickly, right? You're risking careless mistakes. And it looks like it worked out for them through the whole test, except maybe for this 1 question right here. This 1 question right here might have been either a careless mistake or maybe running out of time, although it doesn't look like it. But they still got the perfect score, so it worked out for them on this test. I just watch out for that if they're going to take the test again, that you wouldn't next time want to have that happen where you did have a few careless mistakes through here and now the 51 drops to a 49 or something like that. And the danger point looks like it was this 1 question right here where they really got sucked into spending way too much time. If the whole average for everything is 230, this question's looking like it was a 4-minute question or something. Don't let that happen. If you let it happen once, you might let it happen again. You might find yourself in a position where you're running out of time in this last quadrant or where you're making multiple careless mistakes on questions that you know how to do. So just be careful about that if this person takes it again. Yeah, so we don't see the full data here for the time management pie chart. So this is showing the overall average for every question that's showing up in this chart. But when you actually look at this on the website and roll your mouse over these, you'll also see the average time just for each part of the pie chart. And that's super useful data to have as well. So you want to look at that data yourself when you're looking at your own report. And again, it doesn't come through once you make a PDF. It's only on the live view itself on their website. And Manahimeth, yeah, so you can balance, right? So let's take Quant as the example, 2-minute average. Most of your questions will be in the 1 to 3 minute time range. It's usually not worth it to go much beyond 3 minutes, both because the amount of time you're taking, isn't worth it for one question, and because if you need 3+ minutes on a single question, something's wrong. There's something that you're not getting, or there's something that you're struggling with, or it wouldn't be taking you that long. So you have to be willing to be like, oh, look, this investment is not worth it. Right? If I were like, hey, give me your money and invest it with me, and I'll guarantee you a 100% return, and I'll give you that 100% return in 30 years. Okay, well, that's not worth it. I'm not going to invest my money in something like that. Um, yeah, that's not worth the time that it takes to get that investment back. And the 4 quarters thing here is literally just they take all the questions that counted and they split them up into 4 groups. It doesn't impact how you're taking the test at all. It's just a way to display the data afterwards so that they can give us some data, but not give us too much data that would compromise the test security. So they just go, okay, you answered this many questions. I'm going to break those questions up into 4 groupings and show you the data in those 4 groupings. That's all. And agree, MT. I think this person did an excellent job in this section. Really, really knocked it out of the park on that. Okay, I know that Abhishek put in the link to our forums. If you want to discuss the results further, if we used your results today, or if you didn't have your results in here today, but do want to discuss, just come onto our forums into that folder that Abhishek linked. Type in the data. You'll have to type it out for any data that you want us to take a look at. And we would be happy to help you figure out how to interpret it and what to do or what questions to ask yourself. A lot of times, as you can see, the data is, the data is so high level. And of course, we can't go back and look at the actual questions from the test, that what you're typically doing is forming hypotheses from this data and then going to take a look at your practice test data to try to confirm or deny those hypotheses. But there's usually quite a bit of good hypotheses that you can come up with from this data to help you go figure out what you need to do before you go back in to take the test again to hopefully raise your score.
Hi, Stacey. Sorry to interject, but can you please post the link of that form again in private chat? I
Yes.
can't find it. Thank you.
Yes. Hold on one second. Forums. Sorry, not form, but forums. So yeah, yeah, perfect. Okay. So thanks for coming. I hope you, get the GMAT score that you want and get into the school that you want and take over the world or whatever it is. No, don't take over the world, but I hope that you have a great career and a great experience in business school. And thanks for coming.